it's an artist's palette. It changes all the time.
Hello. Welcome back to the Wild Business Growth Podcast. This is your place to hear from a new entrepreneur or innovator every single Wednesday morning who's turning wild ideas into wild growth. I'm your host, Max Branstetter, founder and podcast producer at MaxPodcasting, and you can reach me at max@maxpodcasting.com for help bringing your podcast to life and using it as a business building tool. This is episode Let Me See You 126, and today's guest is Rob Fletcher. Rob is the founder of Dr. Trouble, the line of chili sauce or hot sauce that is seriously unlike any other hot sauce I've ever tasted before. Rob, aka Dr. Trouble, hails from Zimbabwe, and in this interview we talked about the story of his family recipe that dates back to the 1890s, what was involved in turning it into an actual product, marketing it in more and more different countries, giving back, and even a practical joke that is either extremely sinister or deserves endless applause, depending on how you look at it. It is Fletch. Enjoy the show. Alrighty, we are here with Rob Fletcher, the founder of Dr. Trouble, some of the tastiest hot sauce, Africa's finest chili sauce, coming to us from Zimbabwe. Rob, how you doing? Thanks for joining.
Thanks, Max. It's a real privilege to be on your show.
Absolutely. This is incredibly special. I think you are the first Wild Business Growth Podcast guest recording from below the equator. So this is a whole new equator for the podcast. So I can't thank you enough.
Well, that's wonderful because there's a whole lot going on south of the equator.
Absolutely. I've really been slacking been missing out on a whole hemisphere here. This is really, really neat. I have tried your hot sauces and they're so tasty. I've never really had a sauce like it. Really excited to dig into kind of the backstory as well as what you're doing today and how you are bringing it to new countries and what you're doing from a marketing and selling it standpoint. Before we get into kind of what you're doing now, can you tell us a little bit about your great-grandfather and what his life was like and how it ties back to Dr. Trouble?
Yeah, sure. So basically that's where the whole story starts is my great grandfather, his name was R.A. Fletcher, Robert Alexander Fletcher, and he made the first maps of the region, scientific maps. He was a cartographer, and he was employed by Cecil John Rhodes, the notorious colonial of Southern Africa. He was a Scotsman, and he came out to Africa, I think, with a sense of adventure. His job basically was he would be on horseback and he would have an assistant, and he would disappear into the African bushveld for months on end. He would take his theodolite, essentially drew the very first maps of southern Zimbabwe, which at the time was underneath the kingdom of Lobengula. Lobengula was the Indebele king. Now, the Indebelés were a splinter of the Zulus. I'm sure the name most people know is Shaka Zulu. Lobengula he basically controlled all of the land, and my great-grandfather wanted to make maps there. And so he formed a relationship with Lobengula because he needed to ask permission. And Lobengula was a very, very intelligent man. The idea of maps was profoundly interesting to him. And so they formed a friendship. And the family story goes is that on a visit one day to Lobengula's homestead, Lobengula had some bird's eye chilies growing at the back of his kraal. Now, a kraal is what we call a village here. And he gave a handful of these bird's eye chilies to my great-grandfather, who took them back to where he lived. And he planted these, and we discovered the recipe for this chili sauce in a diary which my great-grandfather kept. And it was a very simple recipe. It was salt and chilies and lemon. From there, the whole story grew. The family used that chili sauce. And then a couple of generations, it disappeared. It was not made again. We owe everything to that first person who explored these lands. The grandfather made the maps, and we still have the maps today, and we still have the diaries. And that's really where the recipe originated. It's been in the family now. That was in the 1890s. The recipe's been in the family for about 125 years. And then anybody who knows Zimbabwe's history knows that there was the land reform program, and there was the rule of Robert Mugabe, and it was a very tumultuous time. And it was during this time that my father and I went through the diaries again, and we revisited that recipe. And it started off with, we always grow chilies here in our vegetable garden, and so we took some chilies and we followed the recipe. And for 15 years, we played with that. Every year we made it. We tweaked it and adjusted it, but it had a very unique way of making it. And it involved using the sun. The sun is our cook. And so after about 15 years or so, my father passed on. I continued making it, and then I was encouraged by friends to sell my first bottle. Like so many stories with the chili sauces, people who tried the chili sauce said, well, you should sell this. I made 100 bottles one Christmas. It was very, very simple. The labels were printed on my computer printer, and I put 100 bottles into the local city, Harare, and all 100 bottles sold. It was at that point, it was more of a hobby than anything else. I never dreamt where it would go. A few months later, I got a phone call from Los Angeles, from a young guy who was in the business school at UCLA. He said he wanted to pay for an order 1,000 liters to bottle and sell in Los Angeles. And I think it was at that point that I thought, well, that's unusual. This can't happen to everybody who makes a chili sauce.
Well, I got to tell you, from my experience,
I never did sell 1,000 liters to Los Angeles, but it turned out that he was a final year business student at UCLA. He then spoke to the professor or whatever it was, and they decided to make it course work for the students. And the project for the students was bring us a business plan of how you will take this sauce from the foothills of the Zambezi Valley, and you will market it and brand it and import it into America. And that's what they did. And the most astonishing thing of all is that I found my sauce, which we had only made 100 bottles of it, was now being pressure tested by UCLA students. And they did everything. They did shelf life tests. They did, being at UCLA, they had access to all the various departments. But the most important thing to me was they did taste testing across Los Angeles. So they approached all the various demographics that are in Los Angeles. And from there, they derived a number. So he phoned me one day and he said, well, I've got to tell you that we got an 84. So I had no idea what that meant. So I said, well, explain that to me. He said, well, it's a mark out of 100. And he said, essentially, what they say is that if you score 33 out of 100 in the demographic test, it's considered marketable across the USA. So he said, your response to your flavor is off the scale.
Wow.
I think it was at that point that we started to look really seriously at it and think, well, this can't be usual. We are perhaps onto something which we should pursue. And since then, it's become my passion.
That's so cool that this recipe is something that literally comes from something your great grandfather wrote down and toyed with over 100 years ago. When you and your father first looked back at the diary and saw the recipe there, Did you have any idea that this was something that you could turn it into an actual product, an actual thing that people would buy around the world?
Max, where I live, the most important thing is to export. If anybody who knows the Zimbabwean story, we are the country which has the dubious honor of being the second highest hyperinflation in human history. We have produced the $100 trillion note. And we've lived through that. I've lived through going into a supermarket or a restaurant with plastic bags of notes in order to pay. I've lived through where you reach the stage where you no longer count the money, you weigh the money. You weigh how many kgs it costs to buy something. So the only way to operate here is with the viewpoint is that you want to sell something elsewhere because that's the only way to survive. And that's what the country needs. That's what our country needs, is our country needs to produce and it needs to export.
What was involved in turning this from a recipe on a piece of paper, a very special piece of paper from your great grandfather, to an actual product that has a name, it has a label, it's got strict recipe ingredients that you stick to?
Well, basically, if you look at my label, if you read into the label, and every facet of that label is a point of pride. There's a signature on the front of every bottle, and that signature is my father's signature, which I took off his will. The arrow and the bow at the top of the label, the center point of the whole brand, is my family crest. We are of Scottish descent, and although we're 120 years or more away from where we came from, we still observe in small ways our ancestry. So I wear a signet ring on my finger and it has that exact emblem. The name Dr. Trouble was in fact a nickname I was given in my youth. So, so every single part of my product is me. It's us. It's a point of pride because undoubtedly we are a family who have survived. We have survived multiple obstacles in human history, and we're still here. So my product is more than just a product that's been put out there for consumption. My product is the recipe is not just a family recipe. The recipe is of our family.
And it's a recipe of trouble, Dr. Trouble, exactly. How did you become Dr. Trouble?
In my 20s, I've grown up in the bush my whole life. I've lived on a farm, and we live in a very, very isolated part of the world. It takes many hours to get to the city. In the early days, that could take various forms of transport. You could use a boat and then a 4x4, and you would eventually get to the city. So when I did get to the city, of course, we took full advantage of the city. And for a brief period of my career, I ended up as a house DJ. We would throw large parties, and it was from that era that someone decided to call me Trouble. And then someone else said, no, he's not Trouble. He's the doctor of trouble. That's kind of where the name came from. Probably the part of the whole branding, which is me. The rest is my family and my lineage.
It's an awesome name. It ties great to hot sauce, chili sauce, something that has a little bit of an edge to it. In terms of the flavor, how did you land on these two awesome flavors and the final recipe after tinkering with it for over a decade?
Well, the original was the double oak smoked. And the reason for that was the chilies used to be, my great grandfather used to have those chilies next to a fire. He would dry those chilies next to a fire and they would have a smoky flavor to them. So that was the original recipe. I discovered after selling the sauce that not everybody likes the smoke flavor. And so we simply made exactly the same recipe, and I omitted the smoking side to it on the lemon chili flavor. That's kind of how it grew. The tweaking that we did, well, the original recipe was very, very simple. And one thing that annoyed us was that when we put it on our plate, it was very thin. And so it ran across the plate. We wanted to thicken it up and make it more into a sauce than a liquid. I love Indian food and I love to make a masala. One of my favorite pickles is mango achar. So we thickened it using a masala made from the ingredients of a mango achar minus the mango.
It's cool. It has the root. I mean, I'm craving this now. I might start having some of your sauce during this interview, but I love chicken tikka masala. My girlfriend and I have started making it ourselves with our Instant Pot, and it's such a mix of wonderful flavors that goes into that in itself. So it's neat that that ties into your sauce as well. And you mentioned how much adjustment and toying with the recipe there was to end up with these flavors that are just awesome. What other moments made it clear that this is a brand that can grow? This is a line of products that people really like, and we'll be able to get this out to people across the world.
The process that we use to make our sauce is not conducive to mass production, and it's something that I'm very comfortable with. There are so many players in the market who are mass producing. It's not a niche that I want to be in. This is a passion of mine, and every single year is different. We use all natural ingredients. I use absolutely no chemicals or emulsifiers or stabilizers or flavorants or anything else like that. It's a living animal. Every single year is different. We source the majority of our lemons from the local communities. I where I live, there are villages and isolated spots all around me, and every single village has a lemon tree. Those lemons are totally organic. There's no fertilizers and pesticides or anything else. These are subsistence people with different seasons without irrigation. Your lemons are different. You can have a season where you have a drought and your lemons are tart. You have a season with lots of rain and you get big juicy lemons with a lot of sweetness in them. My sauce is never really the same from year to year, and this is a very big break from what's out there. We're not making a product which is homogeneous. We're making a product which adapts to the environment. It has a different character every year. And this is something which the Zimbabweans, the first market I ever sold and have grown to love, is that we have a vintage on our product. The sauce that we made in 2017 and the sauce that we made in 2019, whilst have the same notes, have a nuance to them. And that's something which I love doing, is that my factory is not a chemistry lab. It's an artist's palette. It changes all the time. We truly cook. Our ingredients change. Some seasons the chilies are hotter. So it's an adaptation, and that's what I love doing. There's a continuous process of creativity, and I think that's what really drives us with the sauce. We're not creating something which will always be the same. We are creating something which reflects us, the season, which reflects the soil, it reflects the rainfall, it reflects Mother Nature, what Mother Nature is dealing to us, and Mother Nature deals us different cards every single year.
What if one of those cards dealt to you was a podcast idea? If you want a podcast for your brand, but you know it's not in your best interest to spend all the time it takes to do the behind-the-scenes work of having a podcast, email me at max@maxpodcasting.com. Now, let's enter the ballpark of Rob's creativity. So let's go more into that creativity ballpark there. What's involved with making a batch in not your chemistry lab, but in your artist palette? How do you know when you have a winner, when you have a recipe or a batch that deserves to be a final product and will do well in people's taste buds?
Every single day we go in there and we'll make a batch, and the lemons can come from different places around us. The local communities where we source the lemons from, the key to what we are is our lemons. I think we're the only product on the world market which is 100% pure lemon juice. There's no vinegar or anything else in our product. So the day probably starts early at 4 a.m. when the first deliveries of lemons will start arriving during the lemon season. I will then choose and pick and taste different lemons. And then from that, I will make a blend, because we've got various varieties out there. There's a variety called the Missouri Rough Lemon, which is a very rough skinned big lemon. And then you've got more conventional lemons like the Eureka. I'll make a blend. We go into the commercial kitchen factory. We'll do our mix. And I think the key is that all the chili sauces really on the market today mostly have a fermentation process. Our fermentation process is very, very unusual. The fact that we're using lemon juice, which is more acidic than vinegar, and that's an inhibitor to fermentation. And so our fermentation process lasts from 60 to 150 days. It's dependent totally on the weather. If we've got a lot of cloudy weather, the process takes longer. Night times, of course, the process stops because everything cools down and fermentation slows down. And we make it in 30-liter batches. So we will roast our chilies, and whether it's the oak smoked, then we have huge smoking boxes. We pour the chilies in there, and they get smoked over oak chips. And the reason it's called double oak is that when the smoking process is over, we then take all the chilies out and we start again, and we do it twice. The lemon chili, the chilies are roasted with no wood chips, so they get charred and well matured and burnt by the heat. All the ingredients then go into a 30-liter flagon. The flagons go out into the sun, and then they sit there. And they sit there for 60 to 150 days. It's really, I go around every day and I choose which flagons have finished the process. They come back into the factory, they get pasteurized, and then we hot fill all the bottles. And then the very next day at my breakfast, I have samples from everything that we've made. I eat an enormous amount of my own product.
I was going to say, your tongue has been through a ton. I think it's very resilient.
Well, thankfully, we're not a Carolina Reaper, habanero. My philosophy on chili sauce is that chili sauce should be an accompaniment to a meal. It should never overpower. You should never burn your mouth out. You should never ruin your palate. It should complement the food you're eating. And lemon juice basically complements just about all foods. And it's a problem I've had with the name Dr. Trouble. It's quite an ominous name for a buyer. But really, the point of it is to enhance your eating experience, not to try and break the nuclear barrier on heat.
I would hope not.
So that's what I do. I have a whole line of bottles around my breakfast plate. I test every single bottle, and I've thrown away thousands of liters of sauce because they don't match up to what I'm looking for. And so that's basically how my quality control happens, is that it's me personally having a taste of every single thing we make.
It's so fun that you do that, and literally every day you can test out new batches, and it's kind of like a wine sommelier, and how over time your palate gets so much better and you're able to detect these very specific notes I imagine the same thing applies to you in the chili sauce world. And it's crazy to think about how, this happens. It's grown in one area and you've now brought it into new countries. And as you mentioned, the importance of exporting from Zimbabwe. What are the biggest things that you and team have thought about when you are launching into the UK or you are getting into the US?
I think it's very difficult when you really love what you do, and if you really love your own product, you probably, in a very forgiving way, have a great confidence in what you're doing. And I think we are doing something which is truly different out there with what everything else I've seen. That being said, what's happened to us in the last year has been quite remarkable. I had never expected that we would ship our first container of 30,000 bottles to the UK and within 2 months be the #1 bestseller on Amazon for a few weeks. And we've remained in the top 100 on Amazon UK since we launched. So it's been absolutely remarkable. I think our growth has been 800%. I'm left facing the new year with a very exciting amount of changes as to how we ramp up production. Considerable investments needed, but I've always believed in organic growth. I don't borrow money. It's really been a roller coaster.
So let's get to a fan favorite segment called the Wild Business Shout Out of the Week.
The Wild Business Shout Out of the Week.
Okay, anxious for it.
I'm with you. Wild Business Shout Out of the Week. This is where we talk about a creative marketing advertising campaign approach that caught our attention. And Nando's chicken. I love Nando's when I studied abroad in London, and in Zimbabwe and many countries, they take a bit of an interesting approach to their billboards, their advertising specifically. Can you share some of what you've seen in Zimbabwe from Nando's standpoint?
I take my hat off to Nando's. What an amazing, amazing product and organization, and what an amazing advertising and marketing team involved. It's probably because of Nando's that I've steered my product in a totally different route, because there is no point in trying to compete with Nando's. And I have to thank Nando's, because Nando's, which originated in South Africa and then jumped into Zimbabwe and then from there to the whole world. I was reading recently that Nando's success in the UK has grown the whole market for all chili sauces. So it's because of them that more people are buying chili sauce. It's an amazing thing. And I've always loved their marketing. They have a very irreverent style. And I've noticed that in different regions, they adapt in and their advertising is based, they don't use images or anything else. It's just text on a billboard. It's so wonderfully simple and so wonderfully clever. So for example, they've been promoting the Nando's loyalty card in the UK. And they've got things like, it won't work by swiping it at the gym you never go to, the Nando's loyalty card. And they take pot shots at other people like KFC. Turns out finger licking isn't good.
Ooh, shots fired.
Yeah, proper shots fired. And I would love to see KFC try and reply, but they won't. They won't. I think at one point in Zimbabwe, they brought out some advertising where they were threatened with closure in the country and they had to apologize and withdraw adverts.
Wow.
And things like that, but very pertinent and absolutely targeted at their customers, and their customers love it. So if I had to choose anybody who has impressed me, I would say Nando's.
Yeah, that's a great example. It just adds so much character to the brand. It adds so much life to it compared to, I mean, there's so many companies out there that make chicken, and there's so many fast food places, there's so many dining establishments. Creative advertising like that is a really good way to add some personality to your brand, and to your point, make it something that people are excited to go to and eat at, as opposed to a brand that doesn't really show any personality. So I really like that example there. Let's wrap up with some rapid fire Q&A. Are you ready for it?
Go for it.
All right, let's get wild. What is the hottest pepper that you have ever eaten personally?
So I'll tell you a story. I was in a shop in our local city, Harare, one day, and an Indian guy was standing next to me at the counter, and he found out that I was the maker of Dr. Trouble, and he said to me, "Well, would you like to try a cashew nut?" So I looked at him suspiciously, and I said, "Show me your cashew nuts." And he brought me a packet of cashew nuts, which looked suspiciously dusted with something. I licked my pinky and I touched it on a cashew nut and tried it. And I immediately detected the Carolina Reaper.
Oh no.
So I didn't partake of the cashew nut. I had a giggle and I said, "I know what you're trying to do." I said, "But will you please give me a packet of your cashew nuts?" And I then took the long journey back to the foothills of the Zambezi Valley, got back to the farm, and my amazing wife, Lucy, who basically does everything which is makes Dr. Trouble a business, was sitting at her computer, and I pretended to be chewing with an open packet of cashew nuts, and I walked in, and she loves cashew nuts, and I said, "You want a cashew nut?" And so, without looking up from the screen, she put her hands in the packet and put 2 or 3 cashew nuts in her mouth. Then my children and I broke out into giggles because about 3 minutes later, my beautiful wife was standing in the garden with a 2-liter bottle of milk, pouring it
Oh my God.
into her mouth and calling me all kinds of names.
I see where Dr. Trouble comes from now.
I think you do. I think that's probably a very good example of
Oh my
Dr.
God.
Trouble.
That's an intense practical joke there. That's I think you're lucky that Lucy is forgiving. So shout out Lucy.
She has forgiven me and she does see the funny side of it now. My
Wow.
kids, of course, always saw the funny side of it.
Of course. Well, they're the little troublemakers, the little Dr. Troubles. You mentioned how your view of chili sauce is really that it's an accompaniment. It's a way to add and enhance your meal, but not overpower it. What is your personal favorite meal to eat Dr. Trouble sauce with?
It's a very difficult question to answer because I generally test my sauce with breakfast, something like scrambled eggs, which have a very nuanced flavor, are a great way to test a flavor with because it's a very stable characteristic to test against. So I love Dr. Trouble with my breakfast, but then we love to have a very popular dish in Africa is Periphery Chicken. And Periphery Chicken is basically chicken which is marinated in a form of chili. So it's a spicy chicken dish. We found that painting chicken with Dr. Trouble, it makes a wonderful peri peri. And then in the winter, a bowl of good pea soup or tomato soup with drops inside the soup of Dr. Trouble. It all works. I think the key is I think the key to our success is our lemons. Any chef will tell you that lemon juice and the flavor of lemon goes with so many different meats and vegetables. You know, a bowl of spinach with lemon chili drizzled into it. It enhances and brings out the flavor of the food as opposed to burning your mouth. And I think that's the key.
And then getting mad at your husband and running out to the garden to chug a bunch of milk. But that makes a ton of sense.
She loves me.
You have the best lemons, and lemons are so versatile. It's really cool to hear about that. Even when they're within an overall sauce, it works that way as well.
I think one of the most satisfying things about the sauce, apart from the achievement we're seeing on the world market, is the impact it's having on our local community and the impact it's having on our environment. We started a thing called the Little Peppers Project, and a portion of our proceeds in the new year will be going towards a wonderful organization called IPAF. It's the IAPF. It's the International Anti-Poaching Foundation. I'm working with a wonderful guy called Damien Manda. We've created a packaging and a limited edition version of our sauce. IPAF is an amazing organization. Damien, he served in Iraq and he came out to Africa. And what he does now is he trains anti-poaching rangers. He has a group of anti-poaching rangers called Akashinga. Akashinga translates as the brave ones. The brave ones are an all-female, all-black anti-poaching unit. He basically goes into disadvantaged communities. He gives them a reason to protect the wildlife which they are surrounded by, the endangered wildlife which they are surrounded by. In fact, there's a short movie that's just been made. The executive producer is James Cameron.
Oh, wow.
It's well worth a watch for anybody out there. And it's something that we love supporting. So it's been wonderful to not only create a product. A large part of my personal satisfaction comes from seeing the extenuating circumstances from that. So our local community, each village has this lemon tree, and the lemons are of low value. The local villagers use lemons occasionally when they have flu. They will make lemon tea. But basically, most of the lemons rot on the trees and fall on the ground. And so we've provided an income to them. And now we are supporting a conservation effort, which I think is a game changer in Africa, where IPAF will go into a community. They will draw down on the most marginalized of people, which is a female, in a village in the middle of nowhere, and empower those people. So a community will no longer view an animal as meat, but they will view an animal as something to protect because it's worth protecting.
Well, that's amazing. You already have the passion and history for the brand from the get-go of it being in your family and something that you've grown up with and several generations before you. And on top of that, you're making a real effort to give back and partner with organizations for important causes. And so it's really, really awesome that you're doing that. And I've seen the limited edition packages. They're really, really neat. They're works of art. Rob, thank you so much. This has been amazing. I really, really appreciate your time and connecting all the way around the world and hearing the Dr. Trouble sauce story, your personal Dr. Trouble stories as well. Where is the best place for people to find more about the brand online and actually try out some of your sauces?
Max, we're available on Amazon.com, Amazon.co.uk, drtroublesauce.co.uk, and we're about to launch in the US with our own website, and we're launching in Australia and Germany.
That's awesome. Thank you so much. And last thing here, final thoughts. It could be a quote. It could be any line you want, a little bit of wisdom. Send us off here.
In Africa, we have a saying called Ubuntu. It's loosely translated as "I am because we are." And I think that kind of sums up our struggle here.
And Rob, I am very grateful that you are fantastic at making sauces and talking about them. Thank you so much, Rob, for sharing the Dr. Trouble story. And thank you, wild listeners, for tuning in to another episode. If you want to hear more wild stories like this one, make sure to subscribe to the Wild Business Growth Podcast on your favorite app and tell a friend about the podcast. You can also find us on Good Pods. And for any help with podcast production, you can check out MaxPodcasting.com. Until next time, let your business run wild.
Bring on the bongos!